Before we get to today's episode, I have a few people to thank for their generosity in using the Buy Me a Coffee link to support the show. Thanks to Eric Darlington, Stephanie Mazer, Andrew Abrahamson, Steve Horn, Jesse916, Zach, a mysterious someone, Noel Van Eind, Kathy, Craig Brown, Mike McMains, and Dwayne S. I may have mentioned some of those names the last time I did this, but really, can you ever thank people too much? And now, multiple times a day in cities across the U.S. and beyond, a simple yet powerful message is repeated by the well-meaning, the ill-informed, and the bigoted. Don't go. Avoid at all costs those black and brown, disinvested neighborhoods that have become bywords for social disorder and urban decay. The book Don't Go is a collection of intimate stories and photos that uncover the influence of both subtle and overt don't go messages and the segregation they perpetuate in Chicago. With their book, Don't Go, Stories of Segregation and How to Disrupt It, are authors Tonika Lewis-Johnson and Maria Krysan. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For those listeners who might not know which one of you read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea numerous times before the age of 11, and which one of you was a woodwind playing band and theater geek, let's get a little backstory on you both.
Well, you started with Tonika, so she's got I don't even think I read that book.
It was me, the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Yes, I am that nerd. I loved reading poetry, anything with the arts at a very early age, mostly because I was raised in a family full of creatives. My grandmother, that's who me and my mom and my dad, prior to their divorce, we all lived in the same building, the two flat that my grandmother purchased. And my grandmother lived with her two sons, my uncles, who are really significantly younger than my mom. So they're more like my brothers. And everybody had a creative interest. My grandmother, she used to be an illustrator. She would sketch all the time. She would be singing. She was in the choir growing up. And so she was always singing. My two uncles, they got her artistic gene, and they were amazing painters and illustrators. So they would be at the dining room table, sketching, drawing. My mom, she was into writing scripts and stories. So she was always writing or talking on the phone about some creative plot idea. And my dad is a long time amateur photographer. Like, it's because of his obsession taking photos that I developed an interest in photography. So I was immersed in people who were creative. So it was just literally like, oh, well, this is a thing I can do. I have to just find what I'm interested in. The creative arts was so important in my household that when I just thought, oh yeah, I want to learn music, I'm interested in piano. My grandmother and my mom like got me a piano. Like, that's how seriously they took artistic interests and endeavors. So yes, I that was my upbringing. So when I got to high school, I was in a writing program called Young Chicago Authors. This was in 1993. So it was its third year of being an actual program, because now it's wildly popular. But back then it was just getting started. And when I joined the writing program, they invited us to also take other classes, and photography was one. And so once I took the photography class, I was addicted. They had to remind me to continue to write poetry.
And Maria, how about a little bit of your backstory?
I did not grow up in the Chicago area at all. In fact, I grew up in a small town in South Dakota, population about 13,000, overwhelmingly white. I actually, in preparation for this book, I put on my geek hat and got into the census data from 1970. There were three Black people who were living in my hometown at the time that I was a very young person. So I think that says it all in terms of the contrast. I moved to Chicago in the year 2000, and I have been here ever since.
If I read your bio correctly, Maria, you come from an academic background, correct?
Yes, I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And in terms of my geographical biography, I went from South Dakota to California to school, to Washington, D.C. for a post-school job as a research assistant, and then to Michigan to go to grad school, and then to Pennsylvania for my first job, a little blip in New York City, and then to Chicago.
Tonika, talk a little bit about where you grew up.
People can't see this, but Inglewood, I have a whole tattoo on my arm because that's how important Inglewood is to me. It's my home, the neighborhood that I grew up in, the neighborhood that I still live in. And it's very special to me because the building that I grew up in is part of my grandmother's Great Migration story. And so when I learned about the Great Migration, in school, I immediately knew that they were talking about my grandmother. And us living in that two flat that she migrated to Chicago for a better life, for job opportunities. I was a beneficiary of her migration. And so uh, I really knew early on that, wow, my grandmother was part of this historic movement. And she decided to purchase her home in Inglewood. And so it was really important place to me just because it's where my grandmother chose to live. And also because I was raised there from birth, my first friends ever in life are the neighbors on that block. And I had a wonderful childhood. I went outside all the time. I played with my friends. We would ride our bikes, go to the corner store, knock on each other's doors all day, asking if each other could come outside to play, getting yelled at when we were stepping on Miss Patterson's yard, just being mischievous, playing, throwing rocks, running around into the alley when we weren't supposed to be there. It was really fun.
When was the last time Miss Patterson yelled at you for something?
Oh my gosh. Well, so the thing is, Miss Patterson, she was my grandmother's best friend. So I didn't get fussed at by her a lot. I would only get fussed at if I was in a group. But no, she would not single me out because she knew I was a good kid. So it was a really tightly knit block. And I didn't discover until I started to be able to travel outside of Inglewood and meet people and friends outside of Inglewood and specifically high school, that people thought my neighborhood was horrible. I had no idea that my neighborhood had this horrible reputation until I really got to high school. It was surprising to me because I had this beautiful childhood and I was like, well, what are they talking about? And so that's when I started to develop an awareness that when I tell people where I'm from, that they would start to think things that weren't necessarily the reality of my life. And so, once it began at 13 and 14 years old for me, it continued the rest of my life, me knowing that my identity connected to where I grew up and lived was always in conflict with each other. And I would always have to be correcting people or educating people and about my neighborhood. And then it always became less about me as a person and more about, oh my gosh, where you live, where what do you experience. It was really interesting. Or sometimes it would be the complete opposite, which is people would be really fascinated with how different I am, and I was like, different from who? Like I feel like what? So as I got older, I realized, oh, they have an idea of who lives in this neighborhood, and I'm different from what they think. And so yeah, that journey started when I got to high school.
Tonika, you received a ton of well-deserved press with your folded map project. Please talk a little bit about that.
Oh, Folded Map Project. That is my first baby. All of my projects after Folded Map, they're like the siblings, the younger siblings. But Folded Map is the oldest child, the first child. It is my project that debuted to the large Chicago public as an art exhibit at Loyola University Museum of Art in 2018. And it was a multimedia art exhibit that included portraits, video, an interactive map activity, and photography of homes that are map twins of each other. And so the project uses Chicago's very unique grid map to illuminate what segregation and how it impacts the different ways in which the city is invested in by comparing addresses that are the same on the same block, but 15 miles apart in racially and economically different neighborhoods. And then also bringing the people who live in those homes together to have a conversation and meet each other. And they're called map twins as well. And so that's what Folded Map is. It is I would like to call it a personification of segregation. It shows people how segregation affects all of us in ways that we don't consider in the present day, and mostly in our networks, our relationships, and how that is a byproduct of segregation. So that is what Folded Map is. It's a weird, expansive, crazy art project that brought people together across race and geography.
And Maria, if I remember correctly, was it not Tanika's folded map project that put her on your radar?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a journalist actually who put Tonika on my radar in the sense that I had had a book come out on an academic book really on the causes of segregation called The Cycle of Segregation. And so I kind of was known to journalists in the Chicago area for being an academic wonk they could call to ask about segregation. So a journalist called me out one day and she said, I thought she was just going to, get out my index of dissimilarities and give her some numbers and statistics on segregation. And instead she said, have you heard of folded map? Like, no. And she said, have you heard of Tonika Johnson? No. And then she proceeded to tell me what Tonika just told you, basically, about what folded map was. And I was standing in my office, had my little cell phone up, and I just stopped dead in my tracks and was like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. How did no one do this before, but kind of how did no one do this before, right? But in this brilliant way. And I realized this project was my book. My book is 300 and some pages long. It was like so many of the themes I could just see how the connections fit between this art project and the theories and all the stuff that we had talked about in our book were just come to life. And I mean, an aha moment in the way that no one has that aha moment when I describe my academic book, because it's, takes longer and it's more words. And so the article came out. I was kind of a sketchy quote from me, but didn't really matter. It wasn't about me. And then another journalist called me asking the same time. This time I was smart about it and I knew about it. And the article was a magazine article, so they had a little more space to write a little bit more. It was really beautiful. And I said to myself after the second one came out, okay, I'm officially stalking her in the media. And let me see if I can find her. And so I Googled around. She was raising money for her website to move the exhibit from bricks and mortar to a website. So I thought, maybe if I give her a little money, she'll thank me and then I can say hi. And I did, she did. One thing, we had brunch and it was like, and I was after that brunch, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. She wanted to talk to me.
So we have a black social justice artist from Chicago's Englewood neighborhood and a white academic raised in South Dakota who joined forces to highlight ongoing issues of segregation in the Windy City. This honestly has all the makings of a PBS show that I would definitely watch. Seeing you speak together, as I had the pleasure of having a few weeks back at one of your events, the Bronzeville Winery event, you complement each other so very well. Did everything click right away?
Oh, instantly. Yeah, we're definitely simpatico when it comes to us wanting to help people view segregation differently and to understand that it is not just a black and brown issue. It impacts all of us. And also our passion to want to create ways for people to disrupt it so that they can remove the blind spots that they have that Maria talks about in her book. And my work is helping people become aware of the blind spots with participatory art projects. So we definitely complement each other very well. And it did happen instantly because she was a fan of Folded Map and she reached out to me. And when she reached out to me for us to meet, I was already thinking of how I wanted to expand Folded Map into an action kit, but I held off on it because I didn't have someone who shared the same passion or had the skill set to really build this out. And so when she came to me in the form of an email and a donor of Folded Maps website that I was doing a fundraiser for, it was just like perfect alignment because she also wanted to do work or be part of a project that could expand her work in the sense of she did a book about these issues, but really to be able to create ways for people to disrupt it. And so that's our shared kind of passion, wanting to create ways for people to reflect on how they can disrupt segregation and then also providing actual tools to do so. So yeah, it was definitely, kindred at first sight.
Let's talk about how you prepared for the interviews for your book, Don't Go. How many submissions did you get, and to what number did that list get pared down?
This evolved because of both the time and because it was an academic and an artist working together. But the short version of the answer is there were about 70 people who saw Tonika's posting on social media asking for their Don't Go story.
That surprised me. And that was pretty much when I knew, oh, we done hit a pulse. Like, even with Folded Map, it took time for me to get participants. This was within less than a couple weeks.
We didn't know that we were going to then interview them. Tonika didn't know we were going to interview. We didn't know what was going to happen. But once I got my little hands on the password and I read them, and once I realized how wide-ranging they were, how fascinating, some were short, some were long, they were young people, middle-aged people, older people, I was like, this is a treasure trove. I'm not done hearing these people's stories. We need to hear more from these people. So yes, I created a very complicated plan like a sociologist is supposed to do. Had a protocol, had an interview schedule, what the questions I wanted to ask. And Tonika kept me around because we knew that many of the storytellers were going to be white and Tonika had the correct that oftentimes talking to white people, you match the interviewer with the respondent, if you will, in social science research, race of interviewer matching, we call it, because people sometimes are more comfortable speaking to someone who shares their racial background.
She's a sociologist, so she already knew the fact that, this was a thing to consider. I didn't know that. I was just like, are they going to feel comfortable talking to me, a Black person, about all of the horrible things they were taught to think and believe about Black people in Black neighborhoods? And so we went into the conversation thinking that could be the case. So that's why we decided to just do it together, and have Maria ask certain questions. But what we realized was, which was a surprise to me, is that people really wanted to talk to me because of their familiarity with my work. And so the way in which this offered us to have a different experience than I would think maybe a sociologist kind of doing interviews is that people were familiar with my folded map project, most of them. And so they came to the conversation like prepared and open to share all those things with me. Because I guess, just knowing that, oh, this is kind of what she does. So, all right, let's talk to her about it. So that really helped us get a little deeper into conversations that could have been impacted by the race interviewer effect theory thing. Is that no, people wanted to talk to Tonika Johnson, social justice artist who creates projects about race and segregation. So they were ready to share their story. So really, it was just about how nosy Maria and I wanted to get. And, their stories were fascinating and so vulnerable and honest that it didn't take much for me to remain interested in wanting to understand, their first memories of anti-Blackness, and you'd think, oh gosh, that's a crazy question to have to answer to somebody who's Black. But thankfully, my Folded Map project enabled those conversations to be easy, because I think people felt comfortable knowing that I would handle their experiences with care. And one, how easy it was to talk to Maria and I. And so the conversations just naturally went places that none of us expected.
You mentioned the word vulnerable. I guess I'm curious as to whether you had anybody who was incredibly vulnerable, shared their story, and then decided sometime after the fact that they weren't really comfortable being part of the project.
That happened a couple of times. And Maria's memory is better than mine because of how she was logging everything. But yeah, it did happen. And also, it happened in the editing process because, we shared the stories back with people. Now, mind you, we started this in 2020. Yeah. So we've been working on the book for the past few years. So by the time we shared some of the stories back with the storytellers, a couple years had passed. People evolve. People sometimes are like, "Oh my God, I said that," because people had grown since they had spoken to us. They had continued their journey of all of this reflection, and sometimes they were like, they had to reconcile with themselves the place that they were, mentally when they interviewed with us. They had to just negotiate like, well, this is part of my journey, even though I don't think I said it the best way at that time. So we did give them an opportunity to kind of be okay with the stories. And for the most part, across the board, people were comfortable in our interview being a timestamp on where they were in their journey. And they're just really happy that we kept in touch, and they were really grateful that we did share kind of what was going to be published with them. So because of that, there wasn't a lot of storytellers who wanted to change a lot. I will say Soren, oh my gosh, Soren is so funny. He is such a brilliant, thoughtful person. And when he read his, he was like, I have to make some changes. so, so we allowed him, an opportunity to adjust some stuff, but it's still the heart of what he said in his original interview. It remained. So that's why we didn't mind him, maybe rephrasing some things or saying some things different, because we were interviewing people during the pandemic. It was a lot going on. So, we wanted to give people that opportunity to sit with what they had shared and change it if necessary. But it definitely wasn't a change. It was more like just a fine tuning of some stuff, which we totally respected because this was going to be a book shared with everybody, not just so, it wasn't just an interview during the pandemic between us three. So we were like, yes, no, of course, you definitely want to make sure that what you're saying to the world is still reflective of how you feel. So yeah.
In addition to the stories, obviously your own stories and the ones of the interviewees, you do have some great sociology data. There are some very cool kind of topographical maps that show the racial composition of Chicago, where the Black residents live, the white residents, Asians, Hispanics. You also have a page that compares Englewood with the pretty white bread Lakeview neighborhood. A few examples: one of those two communities has 30 banks, the other just one. One neighborhood has 14 restaurants, while the other has 294. Now, while the population of Lakeview is slightly fewer than 5 times as many as those who live in Englewood, even if you multiply the number of banks and residents in Englewood by 5, you'd still be way off. So seeing that in print was shocking for me. Was it as surprising for you to research those numbers and see them laid out on paper?
Yeah, no, I wasn't surprised.
Oh, I think this is how segregation influences your reality. And I also experienced this with folded map people who encountered it. And the example I'm going to give is when I shared folded map either as a presentation or people had interacted with the exhibit, some people, and it was mostly the predominantly white audiences, they would ask, oh my gosh, how did you come up with this project? And the predominantly Black audiences, they never ask that question because they already knew. And so this isn't to say one perspective is better or worse, but to me, it's a good example of how segregation creates blind spots for people. And so for me, when I saw the actual hard numbers, that of course I would never like know for sure, because why would I ever count how many banks and how of the neighborhood that my high school was in, which was right next door to Lakeview. It didn't surprise me at all because I'm like, oh no, this lines up with my experience. I definitely knew that my neighborhood didn't have a lot of restaurants. It's the reason that I appreciated the North Side because I'm like, oh my gosh, they have so many. But for people who have been told to not go to the South Side and therefore didn't go, this information could be surprising to them. Or it could not be surprising, and their justification for it could be rooted in something that isn't necessarily factual, like, oh, it's because it's dangerous. Well, actually, no. The South Side does not have all of those investments because of crime that actually existed before, which is what created the crime. So yeah, for me personally, and I know for Maria, it just lined up with exactly what we already knew to be true. But we knew that including that information was necessary for some people to get it because they have been told to not go to certain neighborhoods. And that's both ways. There's certain North Side neighborhoods that Black people were told, no, don't go up there because they're going to harass you. So they might not have experienced the fact that it's 200 and something restaurants. So, yeah, if you haven't had the opportunity to cross racial, geographical, lines, you wouldn't necessarily know that was the data. But it definitely didn't surprise me at all.
One of the things I want listeners to know is that this book is not just talking about people who were told stay away from the west side, stay away from the south side. Sometimes it drills down to specific streets. One of your interviewees talks about going to school at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park, where they were told don't go north of 49th Street or south of 61st Street, which in some ways seems even more harmful than that overly general, like don't go to the south side, as it really targets specific blocks. Did you hear that more often than you expected?
What's even crazier is that that's advice coming from someone who probably hasn't even been on those blocks. So that's the real insane part. like, where are you getting this information from? Um, one, to be that specific, but then also inaccurate, because it's not like it said this particular block is a hot spot. It gave a specific street to begin the generalization. So, even though they mentioned streets, it was still a sweeping like generalization, but starting from this street on, forward. So yeah, it was, yeah, that particular story, I when that storyteller was telling us, it was just like, oh wow. It does seem even more kind of insidious, because it's like, oh, you really carved out a specific place that people need to stay within. It wasn't even saying don't go. It was just like, no, just stay here. And so that's what's wild.
Yeah, and I think in fact that it's almost the opposite in in the following sense, that mostly when I've talked to white people about the city of Chicago, and I literally put a big map on a table and I say, where would you love to live? Where would you never live? Where have you gone to school? Where have you worked? Where do you go shopping? And they're doing all this and looking at this big map. And when you say, where would you never live? It's a huge swath. It's like, I mean, they'll just take their pen and mark off the entire South Side. So there is not street. I mean, there might be if there's a street address, it's south of Madison Street, like anything that's south. It's a very big, it's not coming from any detailed knowledge of a community. And that it's, and conversely, if you talk to people who are knowledgeable about the South Side or live on the South Side, and often if you talk to Black people, they can tell you this block in all of Inglewood, this block recently has had some stuff happen, but that's very specific, right? So it's actually the opposite. When you don't know a place, I mean, white people are just eliminating the entire, 3/4 of the city. Whereas coming from actual lived experiences in communities where people know which parts are having more problems than other parts at any given particular time. So it's I think Danica in our book is a great illustration of that concept for more specificity. But yes, institutions like universities are giving very clear borders around their spaces to students.
In addition to listening to the stories and grouping them based on the stories' topics, you also talk about ways things can improve. In addition to getting your book, reading about this, kind of taking, readers taking their own stock of themselves and how they address these things. How can listeners make changes in their own lives and the way they go about their daily activities?
So what I love about the book is that we talked to such a variety of people. These are everyday Chicagoans, although I think they're superstars, but they're not, their lives aren't devoted to this. They're small business owners, they're Uber drivers, they're Airbnb hosts, they're teachers, they're social workers, they're small business owners, if I said that already. They're piano techs. And what I love about the book is each of them talks about their strategies for disrupting the cycle. So the Airbnb host who puts books and tourist information about neighborhoods that people probably didn't know coming to stay at the Airbnb about the South Side. Go to the South Side. Here's the great things you can do on the South Side. It's the Uber driver who's educating herself and realizing it's silly that Uber drivers won't go to the South Side, and just talking about how it doesn't make sense, right? It's parents are another big theme in the book, talking about how they can try to raise their kids not to, to break the cycle of the intergenerational transmission of don't go zones of white people.
I hope this book and the conversations that people start to have as a result of either sharing the book, reading the book, it can inspire people to know how important awareness and conversation is. You can't change a thing until you identify it and talk about it. And so that's really what I like to remind people of, that sometimes it feels like, the only way you can change something is protesting and voting. But no, there's lots of steps before that. In order to make a movement, in order to start a movement, to get support of a policy that can become law, that can become a systemic change, you have to have people who are coming together and talking about it. You have to have awareness. It's a critical step to making the change that we want to see. And it's also a step that people have been taught to believe isn't enough. And so people feel like, no, I want to see change now, which, yes, but people don't realize that just talking about this issue is change. Sharing the book or challenging people in a way that you wouldn't have before, that is change. And I just hope that, people who become familiar with my work and this book get inspired to know that that's enough, because all of these issues that we're trying to change, it took decades and many lifetimes to get this way. So to be realistic with this lifetime that we have, like, if all we can do in our lifetime is shift the conversation that can be the foundation for change to come, let's just manage expectations here, like, be happy and be vigilant on continuing that specific change. Because even with protests and movements, what happens? As soon as people are not talking about them anymore, it doesn't become a thing that's funded. It doesn't become a thing that, people care about. Constantly keeping an issue in the mainstream, in front of people, in conversations, it will ensure that change comes. It's when you silence an issue, when you remove a history, that it becomes no possibility for change. So I just want people to know that, just expanding your own personal worldview is enough, because when you do that, it's going to change how you interact with people. It's going to change what you say to people. It's going to influence how you correct people. And, it's just like, it has tentacles. And so I think that we just need to get empowered to know that that's all you can do in a lifetime sometimes. It just help shift the narrative and sway it in the direction that more change could happen. Because I know my grandmother, if she were still alive, she would just be floored at some of the stuff I'm able to talk about. Stuff that she could never, as a young Black woman growing up in the 50s. So, it was stuff they could not say, let alone like say to even to white people in general, let alone advocate for in school. And yeah, so we need to understand the importance of how conversation and awareness really helps make change.
The book is called Don't Go, Stories of Segregation and How to Disrupt It. With me today, Tonika Lewis-Johnson and Maria Krysan. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to today's episode about the book Don't Go. Special thanks to my guests Tonika Lewis-Johnson and Maria Krysan. Their thought-provoking book is available at the link in the show's notes or at fine bookstores near you. If you have any questions, anything to add, or just want to say hi, feel free to send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to the items related to this episode in the show's notes. Anything you buy through those links, not just the ones listed, may generate a small commission for this podcast at no additional cost to you. The art for the Chicago History Podcast comes from my longtime friend, John K. Schneider. Thanks, Johnny. If you need creative work done, John K. is the dude for you. Reach out to him at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. And we'll be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.